Good evening. Can everybody hear me? Yes. Can everybody see the slides? Should always ask that, by the way, when you're making a presentation. I'll get to a couple of other tricks in a second. Before we start, I would like two of the attendees tonight, Mike Rook and Sean Winkler, to come up front for a second. They won a secret prize. They linked in with me on LinkedIn over the weekend before I got here. So this is for you. Tell everybody what you got. My point here is that who here is on LinkedIn? Cool. All the hands should go up the next time I ask when I come back. I stole this off the wall. Apparently you can even get your headshot taken sometime this week down in the J.C. Williams Center. You should do that. LinkedIn you can spend it all in one place, right? LinkedIn will be more than $100 for you. It might be the reason you get a great job. So this is just sort of an example of the good things that can happen when you link in. So join LinkedIn. It's good for you. So thank you. Thank you for linking in. I was prepared to spend much more, but only 2 people linked in, so it wouldn't have gone. The price per head wouldn't have gone down either. So, yeah. So anyway, welcome to this presentation. It's the 4th in a series on entrepreneurial issues and things that entrepreneurs should be considering doing as they plan. And I think it's important for students who want to be entrepreneurs or work for organizations that are entrepreneurial to do that. Are there any theology majors or minors in the room? Excellent. I'm going to need your help in a few minutes. Thank you. Otherwise, I was going to have to pretend we had a theology major in the room and ask a question. So I'm covering a topic that I think is increasingly important. We've all had an opportunity, those of us in business leadership, particularly in the last year and a half, to prove whether or not we care for our people the way we say we do. But it's important for business leaders to do that. So we've done introductions, right? I'm going to talk about why you should care for your people. It should be fairly obvious, but this is an academic presentation, so I might even give you a few citations, one of which will be theological. What happens if you do? Where should you learn? When should you start caring for people? I'd like you to make some commitments. At least, I'm not going to make people raise their hand or sign anything, but I think you should make a commitment to some approach to business as you prepare to graduate from here and go out into the world and do great things. And then I'll take questions. Now, it says questions at the end. Raise your hand as we go through instead, right? That's just in case I haven't gotten any, but if something triggers a question as we're going through, I can see you all as well. So I'll be happy to answer your questions as we go. Is that good? And everybody can still hear me and see me, which is good, because that's important. Otherwise, if I can't see your hand or hear your question, it'll be less interesting, or I'll be repeating you. So with that, why should we care for our people as business leaders or for any other reason? How about Matthew 22, the summary of the law? Love the Lord your God with all your heart and mind and soul. And the second commandment is like unto it, love your neighbor as yourself. That fair? That seems like a good enough reason that Jesus commanded it to want to care for your people. So theology majors, help me out then, because I know this is a business crew, right? Business crowd. But this is not just for the theology majors. So can you help me out, theology majors, with the exemptions from the summary of the law? The profit motive exemption, you're allowed if you want to make a profit to not care for your people. Or they're not in my religion, or they're not in my denomination, or they're not in the same faction of my denomination. No? I didn't think so either. How about that guy who does that thing that's really annoying? Exemption for that? No, not even that one. So this is all to say that caring for people, while it's a business presentation, is something that I think we should all be interested in for fairly obvious reasons. But just in case the summary of the law and a commandment from Jesus isn't enough, hopefully it is, but just in case it's not enough, there might be some other reasons why you should care for people in an entrepreneurial environment or in any business environment at all. Got me so far? We're good? So I'm going to go through by the numbers and some theories on why it's important to care for your people. And then I'm going to give you some examples from some real history. There's a 3-story, 20-year period between a meltdown, and I'm not saying that was my meltdown, maybe a little bit, but there was a meltdown. A global financial crisis that hit the country about a dozen years ago, and a global health crisis that we're probably still not done with yet. but there's some threads that go through that on how to care for people in business. So, by the numbers. A colleague of mine who got his Ed.D. from Creighton, it's a Jesuit university, Franciscans, Jesuits, you all look the same to me. But anyway, he got his Ed.D. there. The reason I got mine was because he asked me to write his recommendation letter. I got interested in the program. But his study for his dissertation last year was on how people your age, in other words, people who get out of college and work for companies, view various types of leadership. And so given a choice between a transformational leader, part of the definition of which is that you care for your people, or a transactional leader who is really only interested in the next deal, moving on, what can you do for me, what did you just do for me, what are you going to do for me tomorrow? Or probably worse yet, the passive avoidant leader who really sort of sits around and hopes everything gets better, but doesn't take any action. Given a choice between those three, which do you think his dissertation, his study of about 500 people, I know where they worked, they got an email, right, and they responded to a survey, which type of leader do you think they preferred? The transformational leader, right? I think that should be fairly obvious. And it matters because nobody has to work anywhere. You can all choose not to come back to work on any given day. There may be reasons not to, like you'd like to make the money and you don't have another job. But generally speaking, people have a choice of where to work. Unemployment's very low. Unemployment in accounting is practically zero right now. It's 1% or so, so call it zero. And so it matters that your people see a leadership style that makes them want to work for you. In my dissertation, which was on the impact of training and on employee development, on performance, and on retention, the idea of a servant leader, and servant leaders are transformational, but they're typified by sacrificing, thinking of the greater good, the good of the company as a whole, and building and leaving a legacy for the people who work for them, so that when they leave, when they retire, the company continues. What do you think the survey found about preferences for working for servant leaders versus, say, I don't know, transactional or passive avoidant leaders? This time it was 3,000 data points. Guess what? Servant leaders. People want to work for people who take care of them. And since people don't have to work for you, and you don't have to work for somebody, that's an important buyer value for the employee. So, I'm going to give you some examples now. Our firm, consulting firms can do this, and firms all around can do this. So if you think you're doing a great job caring for your people, you shouldn't take that for granted. You shouldn't assume that and believe your own headlines, right? Buy into what it is you thought was true about you. So firms like mine and others pay organizations to do surveys. Just about every business journal in every city does a best places to work in Pittsburgh, in New York, in LA, and most of the major markets. And so then there are a number of other surveys that come off of that. Inc. magazine, Forbes magazine, Time magazine, they all do that. I shouldn't do my own animation, by the way. This is what happens when I get to do my own PowerPoint. We try all the tricks. I'm going to read the list. Best companies to work for, best firms to work for, best workplaces, best companies for multicultural women, best places for parents, for working mothers, best working mother firms that are workplaces for dads. Follow me, when everybody can take a leave when a baby's born, for example, right? Best employers for women, best places to work in, fill in the name of the city, best places to work for women. These are all real designations that the firm I work at has earned in the last just 2 or 3 years. Why does that matter? One, can you brag about it at a presentation? Sure. But the employees are telling you, when you survey them, that you're doing as well as you think you are. Or maybe they won't, right? So you don't automatically win when you do the survey. Some markets, it's really hard. It took us forever to get in New York because they're surveying so many companies, but we recently just won that one, for example. So some of the bigger markets are harder to get in. But what happens is, employees who like working for you and say that in surveys do a couple of other things. Also, companies that care, that mattered too. There actually was a title right before this presentation was put together. People magazine did a companies that care list. We made the list, that's good, right? Plenty of other companies did as well. But they specifically focused on, does your employer care for you? Imagine what those questions were like in the last year, right? Pretty important deal. Happier people either stay forever or at least stay longer than they ordinarily would have. So instead of spending money recruiting and training people to replace the people who quit, you get to spend money recruiting and training the people that will help you grow. So even if the summary of the law was not compelling for you because you just don't care, or you think there's a profit motive exception or whatever, right? It's not just the right thing to do, it's good for business. So people who might have no religious beliefs at all probably still think it's okay and maybe even a great idea to care for their people. In which case we should all too, right? I mean, that should be baseline for a Franciscan graduate. So, what happens when you do? Let's give you a little bit on who's interested in watching. All the stakeholders are watching. I said stakeholders, right? Not stockholders, stakeholders. So who are the stakeholders in a company? The employees, for sure, and their families. A lot about why a person stays or leaves at a company, we have found, is because their family feels supported. They think it's okay for dad or mom to work at that company because they can take a vacation. They can take off for the football or baseball games for the kids. They can take a parental leave when a baby is born, that sort of thing. And so the families, we have found, have a big impact on how you care for your people. Some tactical. So for the people who work for me, my direct reports, every year they get a package at home right before the holidays of it's food, right? It's English muffins and bagels and whatever else. It's a big box of food. And it usually arrives right around the time the kids were coming home from college. Typically the first morning when people realize there wasn't enough food in the fridge for the breakfast, right? So you're the hero. It's not that the employee got the box of, food. It's that the family saw that the employee got the box of food from the boss. Because you're re-interviewing and rehiring and re-recruiting not only the employee, but their family. Customers increasingly want to know how you treat your people because they want to know that they're doing business with a company that operates the way they either do or say they do or wish they did, right? And so customers are part of that stakeholder group. They will actually, we're starting to get, and we're starting to see clients get, surveys from the larger companies in the world that want to know about your ESG, your environmental, your social, and your governance policies. They want to know how you treat your people, and that might be a condition for doing business with you. They want to understand how you rate when your employees are asked. Customers matter. Also, quite frankly, just on a subconscious level, I think they can tell when they're dealing with a happy employee who might be giving them a better service or product because they're happier, they're more efficient. It's a more pleasant person on the other side of the Zoom call, the phone call, the email. So customers matter. Vendors as well, a little bit less so because they want your money, right? But the larger vendors are able to choose who to sell to in a supply and demand scenario. And so they're asking because they need to answer the question to their customers because all these types of surveys and vehicles are out there for how do you treat your people. Regulators are now asking as well. So the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, that's who regulates public companies and private companies that would like to go public, has since the first of this, so this is, any accounting majors in the room? All right, so this is a new number, this is a footnote that goes outside the financials in the front part of a 10K or a public filing. And because it's a table with numbers in it, it's the CFO's problem whether she likes it or not, because people expect that the numbers come from the CFO, right? And so the SEC has now required what is called human capital reporting. Kind of almost sounds illegal, like servitude, but what they want to know is, and it's baseline information, they want to know how well your work safety rules go. So how do you treat your people? Do you train people? Do they have vacations and leaves? How many people? What's the ethnic diversity? That sort of thing. But they want now, data is now required of public companies, and banks have been needing this in some, and inside the US, outside the US even more so. So the regulators are certainly part of the stakeholder group. They have a lot to say about whether or not you get to sell your stock, right? And whether or not you not only go public, stay public. And then finally, the investors and lenders who want to see the results of your performance, which presumably should be better if your people are happy. Stands to reason, right? I don't need to do a survey on that. I'm sure there are surveys. You could look it up. Maybe somebody writes a paper on it in one of your classes. Be happy to help you find the sources. But investors and lenders ultimately are the people who decide whether or not you get capital to fund your growth. And they're probably very interested, and I'm certain they are, they may not ask you how you treat your people, although a lot of investors do now, but they'll see the results that are fairly obvious from whether or not you have happy employees. Does that all make sense? Any questions on that? I'm seeing heads nodding, so yes. Professor
How
Sanders.
about one stakeholder, which would be the community?
So, right, and I think it's a fair point. The community is another stakeholder, right? And I view the employees and their families and the customer as a community, but you're right. If you're an employer in a community and you're known as an employer who you're not going to get a lot of help from the government, right? You're not going to get a tax break to stay. So you're right, that's a good point. We'll add it to the presentation. It was implied, but I think it should be stated. It's a good point. He always got me, by the way. He was my investments professor in 1985, just so you know.
I lived for that.
That's right. If you see this, duck. Okay. So let me give you a few examples of caring for your people. This is all really one long story, so I'm going to take a sip of water. And
That's water?
this is water. There's 2 glasses. By the way, I'm glad you sat in the back, because this keeps it, that's good. So, about 2 years ago, it was a little under 2 years ago, we were helping a client through the process of going through a bid for their external auditor. And this is a client that pays millions of dollars for their external audit firm. And so we were helping manage that process. It's a client of mine. It was a client, Dr. Kelly mentioned 2 accounting firms. I was the partner on that account at both of those firms, so we'd met. And so we were meeting with the leaders of the proposed engagement teams from each of the largest firms in the world, the Big Four, the next few accounting firms. One of them didn't bid because they had an independence issue. They do the family's tax work. It's a family-controlled public company. I saw the partner from one of the large firms, who I will not name, but it was one of the Big Four, pull one of the people who works for me aside. And he said, and I saw them pointing at me and doing a little talking and pointing again, which I assumed I was going to ask if the guy didn't come right over and tell me what they were talking about. So this person who works for me came over and he said, this partner from that big firm said that about 20 years ago you threw him out of your office. And he told him why, so I'll tell you why. In the fall of 2001, there was 9/11. Not a great time. 2 months later, at my firm, a global firm with 35,000 employees, we found out that a few partners working on a client, a few partners we'd never met, working on a client we'd never heard of, had done some work that was about to put the firm out of business. And so, what we did, so a little background, we'll give you the backdrop, that's the backdrop. I was a young partner in the firm. I had wanted to be the managing partner of that office probably right around now. That was my goal, was to get there this year, maybe 5 years ago. Most of the partners in the firm, were wondering about their future. The person running the office actually left, just disappeared. So I got an email and a voicemail. This was voicemail before texting, right? The voicemail said, check your email. Check the email. It said, congratulations, you're the managing partner. But it was the understanding that I would be the last one. And so we got a bunch of and everybody else in the office, the other 3 partners, were of the same vintage. We were all about the same age, relatively new in the field. We decided that for our people, we would adopt a posture, because no one had ever been through the firm blows up before, that said to all the big firms who were going to want all of our big clients, right? We were the 5th of the big 5. Arthur Andersen was the 5th of the big 5. Maybe it was the 4th, but we were in the big 5. We were just part of the process of it getting to 4, which was not voluntary or pleasant. And so what we said was we would take a posture, and the managing partner would explain to each of the firms that if they wanted to talk to us about our clients, they were talking about all of our clients and all of our people. The janitor, that nobody who worked for us was going to be unemployed for 1 second. And so that was our approach. And I explained that dutifully as we met with the heads of the 5 families, the other firms. Well, it's kind of how it went, right? New territory, mid-30s at my age, and we said I would have dinner with them the night before the meeting. And the first one in the door, and I explained to them, it's all or nothing, and they all looked back and said, gotcha. The first one in the door, where this person was a partner, he was a young partner too. We didn't recognize each other 20 years later, because guess what we used to have? And we were skinny, we had hair. He and I could use the same barber now. From behind, we'd look the same, right? And so they came in, they sat down, and 4 of us, 4 of them, were in the lobby conference room. And they pulled out a sheet of paper, and it had what, even upside down, I could tell, was a list of our people and our clients. And one of them said, okay, so let's talk about who we're taking. And my 2 other partners looked at me, and one of them verbalized what everybody was thinking. And she said, didn't you do the thing with the dinner last night? And I said, yeah. And they said, okay, yeah, but come on, nobody believes that. That's not going to happen. And so we did a little eye contact, and I said, well, then you probably need to leave. And then they didn't leave because they thought I wasn't serious. So then I said, get out, and they didn't get out. So then I stood up, I opened the conference room door. This was the reception conference room, added 2 words to my comment, and they left. Right. So we asked them to leave. But we made a point. But the point that was most noticeable in caring for your people there was that when I opened the reception door and uttered the last few words, 2 of which I probably shouldn't have said, but it worked, and it seemed at the time like I should have added them. And Professor Zanetich has heard them before. Nobody else has, but just him. So the receptionist heard me say it. And so my office was 5 doors down. By the time I got to my office, the whole office knew that I had just thrown one of the 4 biggest firms out of the office because they wouldn't hire everybody. Now, nobody on that list knew whether they would have been one of the ones to stay or to go. And so what I thought was, here's the concern. It was a risk, but we thought we were serious. We figured we'd take a shot at it. So 2 things had happened. One of 2 things had happened, maybe both. I had either stood up for the 100 people who worked for us in an honorable and demonstrable way, or I had just cut their chances of getting a job by 25% by throwing one of the 4 firms out of the office. As our offices had glass walls, but a wood door, I don't get that, right? Like that was going to give you privacy. And this was in the spring, so March, so people were all busy. As people left that night, everyone who was in the office knocked on the door and thanked me. And all the people who were not in the office called. So why do I say that? Today, I think if I sent a text message tonight from the hotel that I needed people to show up, they'd show up. 19 or 20 years later. Now, what's interesting, and a couple of things happened there. One, it was sort of a legend. Not too many people were sure it had actually happened. Somebody who works for me now heard that story. So now he's thinking, this is somebody who takes care of his people. Right. In the end, by the way, Dr. Kelly mentioned the firm I did go to. One of 3, not the only one, but one of 3 that were wise enough, maybe they heard from the other guys, to come in and not have a list. It was the worst deal for us individually, we knew that, but it was the best deal for the 100 people who worked for us. So that's how that worked. That's the backdrop. That story, which I didn't know a couple of people had told each other, came back a few years later. So the outcome, we did the right thing. We all got to a firm. We all worked there. Nobody who worked for us was unemployed for a second. But there's 100 people and their families who remember. Where are they now? A lot of the younger ones are actually partners at that firm. The rest are retired. They sit on boards. They're chief financial officers, their customers, their clients, their vendors. And they remember that 4 people took care of them. So that's a helpful fact, right? I think that's a good backdrop. 5 years later, I'm sitting on a municipal finance board. I was just appointed by the governor at the request of the state controller to serve on the fiscal oversight board. And I'm duty bound to ask all the accounting majors a question here because I have to say that I've asked. For a large county that can't balance its budget because they believe that borrowed money is revenue. Any accountants, have the rules changed? It's still borrowing, right? Okay. So I sit on this fiscal control board. The chairman of that fiscal control board, who's an investment banker at one of the largest investment banks in the world, but who was an alumnus of the firm I threw out the office. So it's somewhere, he did checking out. This new person's coming on the board. He checked out. They said, he seems like a nice guy. He's a professional. He's a CPA. We hear he's a little crazy. He threw us out of the office that one time, right? But he knew. And so fall of 2007, I joined the board. What was about to happen to the country? A big fiscal crisis. On a Friday in September, he sends me a text because we had chatted about what went on. And his question was, remind me how that keeping your people together thing works again. And that large investment bank filed for bankruptcy over the weekend, right? And it was a big fiscal crisis, right? This guy's 15 years older than me. He didn't need my advice, but he hadn't heard that before. And he used the same exact techniques. He took care of his people. They all went to one bank. By the way, that didn't work out. Banking moves a lot. And then they all went together to another bank where they all stayed until retirement and that sort of thing. 7 years later, a guy I never met. This is not to brag about our approach. This is just to say that that's the kind of word you want getting around. But also that it still worked in a different industry, in a different environment where every person was kind of for themselves. You know, when a public accounting firm goes out of business, the clients need work. You're probably going to find work at another firm that'll, the books of the world will balance. When the fiscal crisis happens and all the banks blow up, nobody has a job in banking, right? And so it worked again 5 years later. Now, the outcome, they all went to a bank. They all went to another bank. He has since retired. His daughter works for us, right? That kind of thing. It's a great opportunity. But it was weird that he had heard from a legacy firm that he had worked at when I was still in high school, I think, because he checked around. Did anybody hear about these people? That the people from that office are a little crazy about their people. We were, To be honest with you, the first thing I told you about was nuts, right? I mean, who are we to throw senior partners of one of the largest global accounting firms out of our office, let alone to do it in ways where I had increasingly had to intensify the language, right, to get them to leave, right? They left. So it still goes on. Now we're in a global health crisis. This is the one where it's a work in progress. I don't know what the answer is going to be. But I'll tell you, there's an entrepreneur you may have heard of. I'm trying to think if you guys have recognized this guy. Mark Cuban, heard of him? Legit billionaire, probably has some good views on how to be an entrepreneur. He says how companies treat workers during the pandemic will define their brand for decades. I think he's right. Because this was another time to prove whether or not your mission statement is true, is accurate, is real. And so we developed, out of the global financial crisis, our firm did, a playbook. And the playbook allowed us, rather in our business, in many businesses, our number one cost is personnel. If there's an economic downturn, what's the first thing you cut? People. Our competitors all what we would call panic fired in March of 2020, April and May. Our playbook suggested that we could start with executive perks for people like me, and then go to our bonuses, and then go to our compensation at very high percentages before we ever would have to fire a single person. And of course, we had smart people who were then motivated and dedicated to do creative things. Short story, through June 30th of this year, we grew 60% year over year. That's a public number. I'm not telling you anything you can't look up in a financial statement of our parent. And we didn't shrink last year either. I don't know that it's only because we took care of our people, but we panic fired 0 people. Every now and again, people get fired, right? It's a 7,000 person organization. There's an annual process of performance improvement. But our playbook said people first. We wrote it after a fiscal crisis, and it got dusty because it had been a decade, right, or more. But we had it, we dusted it off, we took it out for a spin. And it's not that we did it and it worked, it's that we announced we were about to do it. We shared the playbook with our people so that they knew what the potential was going to be, where things were going to head. And so what I'll tell you there is that I'm not ready to, and I said this the other day, we were talking about you never judge an investigation until it's over, never judge a trial until the jury comes back in. Don't judge a military operation every 5 minutes, judge it 6 months after it's over when you can look back at it and see it. I'm not ready to say we're done and we did everything we could have in this crisis, but it's a work in progress where I'm pretty happy where we are now. And what's interesting is the guy who heard 2 years ago the story about me kicking somebody out of someone else's office 20 years earlier, he's going to be the one, because he works for us now, who's going to tell us how we did. So that's the thread, right? When given a chance, take care of your people. They are the organization. I don't care what the business is. They either make what you sell or are, in our case, because we sell other people's time, right? They are what you sell or they make what you sell. So, where should you, let me just make sure I had some things I wanted to interject here. And I got them, good. So, where do you think that you would be able to learn how and when should you start with caring for your people in an entrepreneurial environment or with the anticipation of being a successful entrepreneur? One of my colleagues, famously, whenever you would ask him what he's up to, his answer would always be, work, church, and home. I would tell you that, quite frankly, that was my line all last year, except I would say work, church, and home, except right now, they're all three from home, right? Because that was the reality we were in. Work, church, and home are still great places to learn how to care for people and practice it. Your parents, obviously, that's a big part of your ecosystem, your stakeholder group. So presumably they all did a great job. You're here, you're paying attention. Church is an environment where you can do it as well, obviously, and then home. So from a work perspective, you all have some kind of job, I assume, or did. You've got summer and winter jobs. You're not necessarily the supervisor, but you've got a colleague you can show care for and concern for. You want to practice this kind of thing, right? In the church, everyone's got a lay vocation. We all do. There are clergy vocations. That's why I asked some of the folks in this room, you might someday be ordained with an accounting degree. The church could probably use you, right? Just guessing, right? But there's always a flock, whether it's a lay or a clerical vocation. And then home, your own village, right? What they did for you, what they modeled for you, that's the village. So there's really no excuse for not doing that. And then, of course, here, because as a student, just like for me in the last year during a pandemic, work, church, and home for you are all the same place, generally, right? This is probably where you work or nearby. You probably worship somewhere on campus, and you live either on the hill or on one of the two adjoining hills. You're either on Les Belles or Pleasant Heights, right? Generally speaking, broadly, right? Well, he lives over by the stadium, but you need to pay the professors more, I guess. So here is a great place to do that. And I'll tell you that, and we're doing well on time, which is good, and we'll have time for questions. I'll tell you that because when I was debriefing somebody before the fiscal crisis of 2008 and before the current pandemic, and we were talking about this thing where I might have thrown somebody out of the office rather abruptly. And the whole process, and a couple of people who knew about it were telling them about it in ways that kind of embarrassed me. But what I said to the person who was an alumnus was, everything that I needed to know to get through the fall of '01 and the spring of '02, I probably learned and practiced here for the first time too, right? I was in student government, we served people, right? 3 of the 4 years anyway, the voters were not wise in my freshman year. They chose another guy, right? What are you gonna do? So, but for 3 of those 4 years, I was in an official service role. Only one person can be the vice president or the president, right? So there's other roles, right? I was also in a household, right? It was a household that started out in one wing, it got too big, and it birthed a daughter household. IHI, Prince of Peace, right? We had to do that. And so, is there anybody here from POP, by the way? Yeah, sorry about that, but I have to say it. Yeah, I'm obliged. It's not an insult. So, but we were 40 people at one point who otherwise normally wouldn't have hung out, wouldn't have known each other. different majors, different backgrounds from different towns. We got used to looking out for each other. You have plenty of opportunities to practice. And so the final question I have for you, when? How about now? How about the commitment is now? There's no lack of opportunity to care for other people. There's no good time to start practicing. Don't expect that to be a switch you throw when they hand you a manager title. By the way, you're less likely to be handed a manager title if you don't seem like the kind of person who can care for their people too. So again, we can go back to the beginning. Either the summary of the law, there's a theology professor in the room, so hopefully he's not going to correct me. But either the summary of the law compels you because Jesus commanded that we love one another. And if not, it's also good for you. You can do good and do well. So, from a consequence and commitment perspective, I do want to go through a few things here. So, from a consequence perspective, it's the right thing to do, which is always probably the right thing to do, if you can. But it's also a great business practice. It helps with retention and lowers recruiting costs and lowers training costs when people stay with you after you've trained them. So you can do good and do well. From a commitment perspective, make it part of your business major journey to find opportunities to practice caring for other people so that when you get into the workplace or go to full-time, or if you're already full-time, go to full-time without the class load, you've already gotten used to it. So that's kind of the action I think we would love to see people commit to, but also it's important that it not be just what you say. Remember, we never told our employees at Arthur Andersen in the late 90s and early 2000s that we had this doomsday plan to stick together all or nothing if the firm blew up, because we didn't know that was going to happen, right? It wasn't on our bingo card. We didn't tell people we were going to do it. They heard about it when the reception heard me say something. They saw it though. And it's important from an authenticity perspective. You will fail the survey of your employees even worse than if you didn't have a mission statement, if you have a mission statement and you don't follow it. Authenticity is important. People need to see it to believe it. So with that, I'm going to leave you with one thought. One thought. Life is short, and there is never enough time to gladden the hearts of those around us. So let us be swift to love and forgive, make haste to be kind and do good, and in all things, build the kingdom of God on earth, improve the lives of his children, who are our brothers and sisters, and who are made as we are in his image. Thank you.